Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? The first piece of news regards last week's video. Unfortunately, YouTube's decided that it falls afoul of their community guidelines, specifically encouraging people to engage in dangerous behavior. And while we have appealed it on the basis that telling people not to drink bleach is exactly the opposite, that appeal has been denied. There is a rumor going around that YouTube is attempting to suppress any video making reference to the new coronavirus, at least hard to access, if not outright shadow banning. That's going to make this week much more interesting. We begin with one of the doctors that raised a public outcry over the new coronavirus. At present, it has infected thousands and killed more than 560, according to official figures. On or around December 30th, this 34-year-old ophthalmologist called Li Wenliang sent out a message to his colleagues, notifying them of the new coronavirus. This led to a summons by the Chinese police for rumor mongering, despite the fact that we know what his concerns were are now completely vindicated. It's unfortunate for him that his efforts to deal with this early have been undone by the government. What is even more disappointing is that his death was caused by the very disease that he was trying to head off. This has followed the rather disastrous mass migration across China for the Lunar New Year. This is at least partially associated with how virulent the disease is. Thankfully, it does not have a high mortality rate at approximately 2%. This is comparing favorably with the last major outbreak of a coronavirus, the SARS outbreak of 2002 to 2003. In that period, the SARS virus had a close to 10% mortality rate. This is an important thing to note. There is an inevitable comparison between the Wuhan coronavirus and the SARS virus. Examining the gene sequence has demonstrated an approximately 80% similarity between the two. This is important to be mindful of when we are trying to develop a vaccine. Similar gene sequences in one might lead to vulnerabilities in the new coronavirus. In an absolutely worst-case scenario, we could use similar methods to old-fashioned vaccines, specifically developing antibodies in a large organism like a horse, drawing these out, purifying and refining them, and then using that as a basis for a vaccine. It's a relatively superseded methodology now, but it would be a viable avenue of investigation. Another comparison which has been drawn between SARS and the Wuhan coronavirus is who is affected. As was described in past videos, there is a predominantly older population who have a secondary pathology, something like diabetes or heart disease. This leaves them both more vulnerable in a physical sense, but also due to their age, they have a diminished immunological capacity. This doesn't explain why children seem to be less susceptible to the Wuhan coronavirus, and that has raised questions. It is generally accepted that both the old and the young should have at least a vaguely similar vulnerability to many diseases. A publication in the New England Journal of Medicine seems to throw a degree of doubt on this, where they have found that children might be less likely to become infected, or if they are infected, show less significant symptoms than adults. The handful of case studies that have shown infected children appear to be exceptional in their nature. One has a father who was diagnosed with the virus first, and an infant whose mother was infected and tested for the virus 30 hours after being born. Exceptional cases that do not seem to fit within the larger pattern. As with SARS, there were very few identified cases in children, and unlike other age groups, there were no deaths. There is some concern amongst both pediatricians and epidemiologists that if the Wuhan coronavirus were to reach the population of children, both within China and abroad, that it could spread far more and far more effectively than it has at present. This owes to the way children struggle to maintain some of the behaviors needed to halt the spread. This is things like washing hands and covering their face when they cough. Adults perform this behavior much better. In some cases, adults are self-quarantining themselves in an effort to stem the spread of this disease. This can be seen in Wuhan itself. Drone footage has shown an almost ghost town from what was a major metropolitan center. This follows the official quarantine orders from the Chinese government. Last week, we reported on the ban of all public and major transport infrastructure, but this left certain options available, like private cars and taxis. The government has now followed up on that order and extended it to include private cars and similar. The only vehicles that are currently approved to travel are those that are bearing supplies and cabs. This has put 45 million people in quarantine, and the disease is still spreading. In order to accommodate both the quarantine and infected, the government has pushed for the construction of major temporary medical facilities. Even this has not met the demand for such a large population, and public stadiums and similar buildings have been turned into makeshift hospitals to continue to meet the rising number of infected. And with no sight in end for this quarantine, it could drag out for months. This also raises another issue. The figures we receive are coming through official Chinese sources. They claim that there are about 20,000 infected and several hundred who have died. These figures fluctuate slightly upwards, going up to 25,000 infected and up to 800 who have died. Researchers believe that they are significantly downplaying the spread and severity of the Wuhan coronavirus. More specifically, given the nature of the spread and the fact that there is such a large population who is vulnerable and that the virus is capable of infecting people with surprising efficiency, a report in The Lancet, a medical journal, places this figure at closer to 75,000 people who are infected in Wuhan. This does not include other cities, states, or even countries. To explain the discrepancy between what they've concluded and what the Chinese government is officially claiming, they believe that a number of factors could be in effect, one being a time lag between infection and symptoms. This means that an infected person may delay going to hospital, which would then allow them to pass on the disease to others. There's also a time delay between presenting to the hospital and confirming a diagnosis. This could overall reduce the reporting, but that alone is not enough. The figures they've given also explain that each person who has been infected and has been identified could have infected 2 to 3 others on average. That would allow the disease to double in size just under every week at 6.4 days. They raise the concern that with both the lag in diagnoses and dealing with individuals who do have the Wuhan coronavirus, along with both its spread and virulence, there is a possibility of epidemics waiting to show up in a number of major Chinese cities, which may only show up 1 to 2 weeks from now as the number of infected rises drastically. That consideration is why scientists believe the Wuhan coronavirus will soon be declared a pandemic. This is similar to designations given for other diseases. Better known examples of pandemics which currently exist include HIV. In the past, Zika, Ebola, and malaria have all been considered pandemics. An epidemic is relatively localized, and therefore what is occurring in China could be considered that. It is the spread of the Wuhan coronavirus across multiple continents that's leading to the belief it should be considered a pandemic. There is belief by former officials of organizations like the CDC that it is unlikely the Wuhan coronavirus will be contained. They anticipate it will begin spreading in a similar manner to influenza. With any luck, in the next 2 to 3 months, we will begin to see the rollout of possible vaccines in stage 1 clinical trials. While we're speaking of clinical trials, the FDA has just approved the first drug to treat peanut allergies in children. Allergies to many foods, including gluten, lactose, and nuts, have been on the rise in the last 20 years, unusually on the rise. This has led to many hypotheses about the cause, but addressing the cause does not solve the existing problem. That is where a development like this comes in. At the moment, there are about 1 million children in the United States of America who are allergic to peanuts. The drug is called Palforzia and is intended for children between the ages of 4 and 17. It will generally mitigate the deadly reactions to peanut exposure. This is not a perfect mechanism, and there is possibility that not all patients will respond in exactly the same way. As a result, the organization making it still encourages individuals not to willingly expose themselves to peanuts. It will act as more of a safety net than a primary treatment. It will prevent reactions to inadvertent or unintended exposure. This can occur far more readily than you might imagine. For example, peanut oil is often used in cooking establishments, both as a recipe base and as a go-to oil. This is a very significant problem if you have an allergy. In order to qualify for this drug, individuals must first complete at least 2 rounds of dosing under guidance. This is because the first 2 doses can cause the same symptoms as though the individual were eating peanuts itself. Thereafter, a small amount of the medication can be added to semi-solid food and consumed. This will be increased every few weeks until it reaches a point where the children can consume roughly the equivalent of 1 to 2 peanuts. That is on par with the level of unintended exposure. In the final item for this week, we have an answer to a bizarre side effect to cancer treatment. One of the treatments used for cancer is called photodynamic therapy. It uses a compound called chlorin E6. This has the bizarre side effect of giving people superior night vision. We haven't quite understood why this occurred until now. We do know that it plays on rhodopsin, which is a light-sensitive protein in your eyes. The rhodopsin itself is not the only part of this. There is another compound called retinol. Retinol isn't normally sensitive to infrared light, but what you can do is to separate the retinol from the rhodopsin molecule. This then creates the electrical signal. And, in this case, by using chlorine, the retinol changes. It's then able to respond to infrared light in the same way it would to normal visible light. This drastically increases its sensitivity under low light conditions like nighttime. A bizarre but prospectively useful development in understanding an unintended and unexpected side effect. Applications could be found in areas like retinal degradation. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting or useful, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions below.